Howdy, everybody. Humanities 4, Chess College, Film Studies. How you doing? How was your weekend? Sorry about the confusion with some of the quiz phrasing. I think I finally corrected it all. I gave you guys an extra day to do it. So it's not due till tomorrow night instead of tonight. Tonight's Monday, by the way. So the questions, if you watch the documentary, Raging Easy Rider, Raging Bulls, and take notes. It's all there. What's going on in the culture? What's going on? How these new auteur directors stormed the gates of the old system, Hollywood system, and took over. How they thrived for a good 10 years because their movies were about something meaningful. Their movies were related to by the youth market, which wasn't seeing anything they could relate to. And the way Hollywood was making films up until that point, all of a sudden, the youth market, which is, let's say, people under 25, were seeing films with stories and actors like Al Pacino, Dustin Hoffman, and Faye Dunaway, and Karen Black, and Robert De Niro, who they kind of could relate to because they looked more human. They just weren't these eye candy. And the women were fierce, from Bonnie and Clyde to Chinatown with Faye Dunaway to Karen Black and Five Easy Pieces. They had their own individual stories going on. They just weren't there to support the guy, um, like so much of the films we have now. Think about that for a minute. Anyway, and so it was a golden era for not just male anti-hero actors who were coming up who didn't have to look beautiful like the old days. They were offbeat and they looked real and they looked human and they looked approachable and relatable. And that's very key to all of this. Also, remember how I'm always trying to tell you all to look what's going on in the culture when these films are being made. Any of the films we're talking about, I try to give a historical glance at the culture, what's going on in the 50s, the atomic war, the blacklisting. The 40s was World War II, the 30s was the Depression, the 20s was Prohibition. Before that, it was World War One and women's movement, getting women getting the right to vote. We still had Jim Crow in those days, and so each era has its own cultural significance that mirrors the films, and the films mirror the culture back. And so when you look at the questions for the quiz, that's what you got to think of. What's going on in the culture that is influencing these auteur directors that had gone to film schools, that were raised on foreign films, people like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, Steve Spielberg, and all those that are in that documentary, Hal Ashby, Robert Altman, Sam Peckinpah. And so what they're being influenced, what's going on in the culture that influences their films. Look what's going on. I don't want to give all the answers away, but if you see the documentary, it's very obvious what's going on. Um, and then how did they control the system for so long? Well, their movies are modest movies, movies like Taxi Driver and Five Easy Pieces and Easy Rider and The Graduate were modestly made, modestly budgeted films that made a lot of money. And when the studios make money, they love that and they want to replicate it. That's what they do. They aren't the smartest bunch in the world. It's business 101 with those guys and gals, although it's very few women in those days. And so they held on to their place and they got to make a series of films. People like Robert Altman made the best work of his life during the 70s, from MASH to Long Goodbye to Nashville. Um, Peckinpah got to make The Wild Bunch and Pat Garrett, Billy the Kid, The Getaway, Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, Straw Dogs, and Hal Ashbury made The Landlord and Harold and Maude and Shampoo and Bound for Glory. These are golden era of Hollywood films, personal films. Peter Bogdanovich, who just died a couple months ago, started off the great film, the Last Picture Show, and followed up with a couple of films that didn't do so good because he was so his films kind of went on the skids for a few reasons. He was definitely lost touch with being rich and famous and what that could bring to you. And he kind of lost touch with the audience. And he made films that he loved, which were screwball comedies like What's Up, Doc, which was a big hit, Paper Moon, another big kind of screwball comedy hit. But then he kind of dropped off when he tried to do some musicals and other things that didn't work. Same thing with Martin Scorsese. He had started off with Mean Streets, and then he had people just were blown away the genius of a small budget movie made for $300,000 with an unknown Robert De Niro. And then he made Taxi Driver, and then he made a couple movies that people didn't quite relate to, New York, New York. And he was snorting a lot of cocaine. His ego got out of hand, and so these movies started costing more, and the studios weren't making their money back. They weren't happy with these young auteurs telling them what to do, what was going to make them money. Um Coppola had this huge success with The Godfathers Part One and Two. Then he did, which I believe is his greatest film he ever made, um, The Conversation with Gene Hackman. He's an eavesdropper, uh, a wiretapper, if you will. And then he made the incredible Vietnam War masterpiece, Apocalypse Now, but he went into debt over it, with the excess. Not, I'm not saying drug excess, but the excess of the production. Filmed in the Philippines, cost overrides. He had to mortgage his house to get it made because they wanted to do bigger, better things. Now, did they lose their touch, or do they just want to express themselves on a larger canvas? That they all started kind of failing towards the end of the 70s, and the movie studios looked at that and going, well, what's the next phenomenon that's going to come around? Then Jaws hit. Spielberg was a clean cut, non pot smoking, non hot tub guy, and he knows how to make an entertaining movie for the masses. And Jaws turned out to be the first movie in the history of movies that the box office was more important than the story. Made $100 million really quick, and that was news. Movies didn't make that kind of money in those days. Now it's kind of average. And then it started a trend, the blockbuster trend. It got away from meaningful films like Five Easy Pieces and Shampoo and Nashville, and it started going for what they referred to as high budget B movies, which were kind of like melodramas with good and bad evil people, uh, like in Star Wars, which is essentially a western in outer space. Um, Between Jaws and Star Wars, that helped bring the era to an end because the studios said we could do those. We know how to do high budget blockbuster B movies. We could do that. We don't need these upstarts telling us what to do. And so the 80s became kind of a wasteland for innovation and became more of a playground for sequels. sequels, endless sequels. Starbuck Wars, yes, Jaws, Superman. They all started making sequels, but there were some independent filmmakers who were coming out of that. I'll be talking about it later this week, who came out of the 80s and started what we would call independent film production. People like Jim Jarmusch, David Lynch, Spike Lee, to name a few. We're not going to get into that one today. So when you're answering your questions, people kept emailing me and go, "How long do you want the answers?" I don't have it minimum, but I said, explain it. If you don't explain the answer and I don't feel that you watched the documentary, you won't get the points. If you have a one word answer, it's not good enough. It's an essay, right? An explanation of your response. 5 responses total, worth 3 points apiece, 15 points. The more details you provide, the more I feel you understood it and you're getting it. And there you have it. That's the quiz. We're not going to have a paper this week because I'm going to be grading. I still have 2 more essays to grade and the paper, so I'll be grading all week while you guys will be kicking back and watching cool films. I want to talk today about another cultural phenomenon of the same era, starting about 1970, with a film by a African American director and writer and actor, Melvin Van Peebles, who just died this year. He was almost 90. And he made a film that was made for very little money and it broke all sorts of box office records. Uh, Make sure you watch the documentary. I'm going to post it on Canvas as soon as I'm done talking. It's this phenomenon. What's called, they named it Blaxploitation. Not the greatest name in the world, because, like in the documentary film, Samuel Jackson says, "Who were they exploiting?" Well, that's the name they gave these films, and for about 5 or 6 years, they had a great run until Hollywood came in and whitewashed it all and screwed it up as usual. But for 5 or 6 years, these blaxploitation films made a lot of money. Did they make the money Jaws and Star Wars made? No. Did they get the acclaim that the white films made? No. They played in inner cities, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago, New York, South Central LA, San Francisco. They played in essentially urban areas with a lot of African Americans where they lived, and it was aimed at them. It was their story. Finally, they could see themselves up on the screen in movies like Superfly and Shaft and Coffee Brown with Pam Grier. Um, and written and directed by black directors, writers, starred black actors, and they were the heroes of the movie. And black actors never saw themselves up on the big screen like that. Even in these movies I'm talking about of the 70s, from Easy Rider to all of them, there's very few African American characters, especially taking a lead heroic role, I should say. It was still a white man's Hollywood. And so these independent films, spearheaded by Gordon Parks, who did Shaft, Melvin Van Peebles, who did Sweet Badass Back Ass. It's a hard, you have to watch the film. You can watch it on YouTube. Um, he, they made these films on very little money. For example, Shaft, maybe you've seen Shaft. It has a hit song that was on the radio, made famous. Um, Superfly, no, sorry, I'm Shaft. Superfly was another song that was made famous by Curtis Mayfield. Superfly is essentially about a drug dealer, um, played by the wonderful charismatic actor, and Ron Neal, and he's a drug dealer who's going to do one more score and then go straight. He wants to go straight, but guess who screws him up? White drug dealers and the white law. They don't want him. They're coming down on him heavy. Shaft was about a private eye, played by the charismatic, handsome Richard Roundtree. It was written for a white actor, but when they saw that there was possible money to be made with the African American audience, they put an African American actor in there, and it was a huge, gigantic hit. Uh, One of the reasons why these movies were hits, you'll see if you watch the documentary, was because white audiences were flocking to them also because they're good movies. They're fun and exciting, hip and cool with great music and cool actors. And that the youth market dug it. See, this is what Hollywood never understands about their audience. They never get their audience. They like to pigeonhole everybody. A woman's film is a woman. Only women will go to it. Black film, only black people go to it. A gay film, only gay films will go to a violent film, only violent film. Horror film, only horror film. So that's how they pigeonhole everything. And then a movie like The Exorcist, I don't like horror films, but I couldn't wait to see The Exorcist. It was the most terrifying film I'd ever seen up until that point. Who's seen the original 73 Exorcist? It's in the documentary. You'll see it in there, some of it. And it changed everything. There were lines around the block to go see this movie. It was so utterly disturbing. The novel was a best-selling novel. Anyway, we never seen anything like this. There was William Friedkin, who had done a great film called Boys in the Band. He also went on to direct one of the greatest police films ever made. Oh, why am I forgetting it? With Gene Hackman, Ray Schreider. I'm gonna forget the name of it. It'll come to me in a minute. Anyway, it was a huge, huge hit. Um, we never seen police like this before. Rugged, urban police, uh, going about their jobs in a really eccentric way. Hmm, The French Connection. There it is. These films changed the course of cinema history. They were so much influenced by the French New Wave films, Italian realism films, handheld camera, rough actors. They're not pretty actors, and the language became more how people speak. It's the first time the F bombs are flying, folks. They never flew before. Um, Now people are actually talking how people talk on the street in the movies. This was a phenomenon. These Blaxploitation films captured the zeitgeist of the African American experience in America during a very troublesome time in America when we had the Vietnam War, where more black kids were getting shipped off to Vietnam because they didn't have student deferments and they were cannon fodder for our beloved Richard Nixon. And whereas a lot of white kids had their student deferments and they stayed home until they canceled the student deferments and that anybody could get drafted. Yes, folks, I even got drafted. Um, you don't have a draft. Would you would you want to be drafted? Would you want to be drafted and go fight in Afghanistan against your will? Who knows? Your generations are different because you've never had that hanging over your head. My generation had it hanging over our heads. There was some good wars. World War II was they called it the last good war. We fought a real enemy. Vietnam, we didn't know who the hell we were fighting. Anyway, we didn't know who we were fighting in Afghanistan, and also we thought we were fighting terrorism, but what is that? I'm not going to go there. So, where am I? So that's hanging over everybody's head. And so when these African American directors started getting into these urban films, Hollywood didn't look at it seriously because they go, well, it's all about a certain niche audience, and that's all it's going to be. Well, they were wrong because these movies made money. And when money's being made, that's when Hollywood perks up. Then what they try to do, they come in and they think they could do it better. And so they start hiring white directors, white writers to write these blaxploitation films, and eventually it all got watered down and the air petered out. We're just now into probably the greatest other era, golden era of black actors, writers, directors as we ever have been in the history of Hollywood. Right now, folks, with the horror genres, and I mean, last night, Will Smith won the Academy Award. He's only like the third black African American actor, not actress. Halle Berry is. There's only, I think, two other actors have won um, the Academy Award for acting. So, but it's a good time right now in the country to be an African American filmmaker, writer, director, actor, performer, musician, because it's taken many, many years for the walls to come down, but they're crashing down now. So kids were, the youth market wanted to see something they can relate to, started with films like Bonnie and Clyde. They're cool outlaws, young, vibrant. Yes, they're killers, but they made it look cool, and kids were had the Vietnam War hanging on their heads, and all of a sudden they saw that film over and over again. I was one of them. Then we had The Graduate with a very charismatic but nondescript Dustin Hoffman, very anti-star looking actor, trying to figure out what he's going to do after college, which we all can relate to. You can relate to it now, folks. What are you going to do? That's always the next question. Now what? And that film captured the angst and the zeitgeist of what that generation was feeling about their futures. And then here comes Easy Rider about two hippie motorcycle riders who do a drug deal so they could be free and have to not have to work a regular straight job, and they could be free on the road, do whatever they want. Of course, where did it get them? It didn't end well. Who's seen Easy Rider? Who knows the ending? I don't want to give it away, but it does not end well, folks. There's a cost for the freedom. But then we're off and running. Irreverent films like MASH, which was essentially a satire in Vietnam, although it was set in Korea. Vietnam was still raging, so it was too soon. You couldn't do a satire in a war that's still going on. At least they couldn't in those days. But everybody knew it was a thinly disguised version of Vietnam, except for they set it in Korea. And then we have movies like Five Easy Pieces about the disgruntled Jack Nicholson, perhaps I think his best role he's ever done before he became, the cliche Joker in the Batman, about an upper class guy living a lower class life because he doesn't know how to relate to the world around him. And the kids going to these movies were feeling that. Where do I go? Who am I? Why am I here? It's an existential question that we're all dealing with. These movies captured that. And some of them did it by criminal activities like in Mean Streets or Badlands. And we related to it because we all were feeling disenfranchised from our government, from our employers, from the boss, from the man, whatever you want to call it, from colleges. We didn't know where to go. And these movies captured that restlessness and that unknown quality about our lives. And that's why they were so popular. Everything was changing. It's the 60s, man. The music was changing, attitudes were changing, styles were changing, everything was changing. We had Nixon in the White House. More people are getting killed than ever before in the streets of America. In Vietnam, we still were dealing with Cold War and Soviet Union, pollution, environmental breakdowns. And so these movies gave us hope. Simple as that. They gave us hope. And that is rare indeed, folks. They always ask this question to musicians, Beatles, Stones, whoever, Springsteen, to filmmakers from Spike Lee to whoever your favorite filmmaker is. Can a work of art, a film, a song, a painting, an opera, can it change? Can it change things? The cynics will say, "Oh no, it takes more than that." I disagree with that. The Beatles changed everything. Everything, folks. Francis Coppola and the Godfathers movies changed everything. James Dean, Marlon Brando, they changed us. Yes, art can make a difference. So don't ever think it doesn't, it's that important. Good luck on the test. Hope it's clear now. I'll talk to you in a couple days when the story film continues. And remember, everything is cinema.